The mansion stood tall against the sky, its windows glimmering like watchful eyes. To the neighbors, it was a palace of wealth and power, where everything ran with precision, as if life itself bowed to the rhythm of the rich who lived inside. But in the kitchen, scrubbing the marble counters until her hands ached, stood Rosa, the maid who carried her world not in jewels or luxuries, but in the quiet strength of survival. She had only taken the job because her son was sick, and the wages, though small, promised medicine, food, and maybe a chance at stability. The mansion belonged to Mr. Harrington, a businessman feared more for his cold demeanor than admired for his fortune. Rosa had seen men like him before, calculating eyes, clipped words, a presence that filled every room with unspoken rules. She stayed out of his way, kept her head down, and did her work with the kind of diligence that made her invisible. But life has a cruel habit of twisting moments of silence into storms. It began one afternoon when the mansion's halls echoed with an unusual sound, the baby's cry. Mr. Harrington's wife had been away, the nanny had left earlier than expected, and for hours, no one tended to the child. Rosa tried to ignore it, her heart pounding with every wail, each cry like a blade cutting into her chest. She knew hunger when she heard it. She had held her own son during nights of emptiness, praying for milk to fill him, praying that tomorrow's work would buy enough bread. And then, against all logic, she made a choice. Trembling, she lifted the fragile baby into her arms, whispered soft words, and gave him what he desperately needed, her own milk. For Rosa, it wasn't a question of right or wrong. It was instinct, the primal call of motherhood that does not discriminate between her own child and another. She knew the risk. She knew that if the boss discovered her, it could mean shame, accusations, even the loss of her job. But she also knew that a child's life was worth more than her fear. What she didn't know was that this act of compassion would ignite a firestorm that would threaten everything she had built. And yet, strangely, it would also be the beginning of her redemption. And that's where our story truly begins. Before I continue, I want to pause for just a second. If you're here listening to this story, it means you believe in more than just words. You believe in the power of human choices, in how one small action can change the course of a life. So, I ask you, if this story already has your attention, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment telling us what you think. Your support helps us bring more stories like this one, raw, emotional, and unforgettable. Now, let's return to Rosa and the secret she thought would remain hidden. What Rosa didn't realize was that Mr. Harrington had already noticed something was off. He was a man who paid attention, who controlled his environment down to the smallest detail. And when the crying stopped, replaced by silence and the faint rhythm of contented breaths, his curiosity sharpened like a knife. He walked down the corridor, his step steady, his shadow stretching across the polished floor until it reached the nursery door. And there, with the handle in his hand, he pushed it open, only to find a sight he never expected. Rosa froze. The baby lay against her chest, eyes closed, no longer crying but breathing in peace. In that instant, she felt her world collapse. The room spun, her lungs shrank, and her body stiffened as if bracing for an execution. She expected shouting, rage, maybe even the cruel snap of words that would strip her dignity away. Instead, Mr. Harrington simply stood there, silent, watching. The silence was worse than anger. It was judgment without a verdict, a mirror that forced her to confront the weight of what she had done. She wanted to speak, to explain, but her lips trembled and refused to open. For a heartbeat, two lives hung in balance, the fragile trust of an employer and the fragile life of a child who, just hours ago, had cried for survival. But then, Mr. Harrington stepped closer, and instead of rage, something flickered in his expression, something Rosa had never seen before. Not softness, not yet, but something almost human. Mr. Harrington's footsteps echoed faintly on the wooden floor as he approached, and Rosa's grip on the child instinctively tightened. She felt like a criminal caught red-handed, though all she had done was answer a cry for help. The baby stirred gently, unaware of the storm raging above him, and nestled deeper against her chest. Rosa's heartbeat pounded so loudly she was sure it filled the room. Mr. Harrington didn't speak right away. His eyes locked on hers, heavy with something she couldn't name. Suspicion, curiosity, maybe even recognition. The seconds stretched, suffocating her. Finally, his voice cut through the air, deep and deliberate. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even sharp, but the calmness of it chilled Rosa to the bone. She stumbled for words, her throat dry, her tongue refusing to obey. "Sir, I'm sorry. The baby, he was crying for hours. He was starving. There was no one here." Her explanation tumbled out broken, desperate, like a confession in front of a judge. She knew how this would sound to him. Improper, scandalous, unacceptable. But she had no choice. She looked down at the child, now peaceful, and whispered, almost to herself, "I couldn't let him suffer." Mr. Harrington's face remained unreadable. His silence was unbearable, and Rosa felt her knees weaken. She imagined the headlines, Maid dismissed for crossing boundaries, and the whispers among the other staff, the shame she'd carry back home to her neighborhood. She pictured her son, frail and coughing, asking why she wasn't working anymore, why the medicine never came. But then something unexpected flickered in his eyes. Not quite pity, not quite anger. Something more complex, tangled. He leaned against the nursery doorframe, studying her as though she were an unsolvable equation. "You realize what you've done could be seen as inappropriate? Even dangerous?" "Yes, sir," Rosa whispered, her voice breaking. "I know. I'll accept whatever consequence you decide. But please know, I meant no harm. I only wanted to keep him alive." The weight of her words seemed to hang in the air, stretching between them like an invisible thread. Mr. Harrington looked at his child, then back at her, his jaw tightening. And then, instead of shouting for her dismissal, instead of calling her reckless or throwing her out on the spot, he said something that stunned Rosa to her core. "Follow me. Bring the baby." Her breath caught. She hesitated, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Was this a trick? A test before punishment? But Mr. Harrington was already turning, his hand gesturing for her to come. Reluctantly, clutching the baby close, she followed him down the hall, each step echoing like a drumbeat of fate. He led her not to the kitchen, not to her tiny servant's quarters, but to his private study, a place Rosa had never been allowed before. The air there was thick with the smell of leather and oak, the walls lined with books whose spines gleamed with golden letters. Rosa stood awkwardly, still rocking the baby in her arms, afraid to breathe too loudly. Mr. Harrington closed the door behind them. He moved to his desk, resting his hands on the polished wood. "Sit," he commanded, nodding toward the chair across from him. Rosa lowered herself slowly, cradling the infant, her stomach knotted with dread. She braced for judgment, for accusations. Instead, Mr. Harrington leaned forward, his gaze softer now, almost reflective. "You said you couldn't let him suffer." His voice was quieter, more thoughtful. "Why?" The question stunned her. She blinked, searching for words. Because no child should," she finally whispered. "I've seen suffering. I've held my own boy in nights when there was no food. His cries." She paused, swallowing hard. "They echo in me even now. I couldn't ignore it, not even if it cost me everything." Her words seemed to strike something in him. For a brief moment, his stern mask slipped, and Rosa glimpsed a man carrying his own ghosts. His eyes shifted to a photograph on the desk, a young woman holding a child, smiling. The frame was turned slightly away, almost hidden. Rosa realized then that grief lived here too, silent but unrelenting. Mr. Harrington exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "Most people would have walked away. You didn't." Rosa lowered her gaze. "I couldn't." Silence filled the study again, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was contemplative, heavy with unspoken truths. Then, to Rosa's astonishment, Mr. Harrington said, "You may have saved his life today, but saving lives comes with consequences." Her heart clenched. The words sounded like both warning and acknowledgement. What did he mean? Was she forgiven or condemned in some new way? Before she could ask, he gestured toward the baby. "Lay him in the crib beside you. Then we'll talk." Rosa obeyed, carefully placing the child down. She smoothed his blanket, her hands trembling, before sitting back. When she looked up again, Mr. Harrington was watching her not as a servant, not even as an intruder, but as something she had never expected. An equal in a moment too raw to be ignored. And that's when the story began to shift, not toward the punishment Rosa feared, but toward something far more unpredictable. The baby's breathing filled the silence of the study, soft and steady, like waves against a distant shore. Rosa sat on the edge of the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, every muscle in her body tense. She didn't dare move, didn't dare speak first. Mr. Harrington leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. His gaze was fixed not on her, but on the small child sleeping peacefully in the crib. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, and Rosa almost wondered if he had forgotten she was there. But then, without shifting his eyes, he spoke. "You know what the world would say if they knew." The words landed like a hammer. Rosa felt her chest tighten, her breath catch. She nodded slowly, afraid to meet his eyes. "Yes, sir. They would call it scandalous, improper. They would say you overstepped your place." His voice was calm, measured, but there was a sharpness beneath it. "And they wouldn't be entirely wrong. Do you understand that?" "I do." Her voice cracked. "I crossed a line. I know that. But I couldn't." "You couldn't let him suffer?" he finished for her, finally turning his gaze back to her. His eyes searched her face, as though looking for any trace of insincerity. "You've already told me that. But what I want to know, Rosa, is whether you truly understand what you've risked. Not just your job, not just your reputation, but the perception of this household. My name." The weight of his words pressed down on her shoulders. She wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear. "I'm sorry, sir. Truly. I didn't think about any of that. I only thought of him." For a long moment, he studied her, his expression unreadable. Then he rose from his chair and walked toward the window. He pulled the curtain back slightly, staring out at the sprawling garden bathed in late afternoon light. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, a man torn between control and something softer, something dangerously close to vulnerability. "I lost my wife 2 years ago," he said suddenly, his voice quieter now. "She died giving birth to him." He gestured toward the crib. "And since that day, everything in this house has been mechanical. Nannies, schedules, money. All precise, all efficient, but never enough." Rosa's heart clenched. She had not expected such a confession. It felt like trespassing into a wound he never showed anyone. She lowered her eyes, unsure if she was even allowed to respond. Mr. Harrington let the curtain fall back into place and turned to her again. "Do you understand what that means, Rosa? My son has never known his mother's touch. Not once. And today, for the first time in his life, he felt it. Through you." Her breath caught. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. She wanted to explain that it hadn't been about replacing anyone, that she had acted only from instinct. But before she could speak, he raised a hand. "Don't mistake me," he said, his tone sharpening. "This doesn't absolve you. It doesn't mean I can ignore the rules of society. If anyone outside this house knew, they'd twist it, turn it into something vile. And I cannot allow that. Do you see my dilemma?" "Yes, sir," Rosa whispered, her voice barely audible. "Good." He returned to his desk, placing his hands flat on its surface. "Because this leaves me with a choice. I can let you go, quietly, without scandal. Or," he paused, the word hanging heavy in the air, "or I can decide that what you did today was not a crime, but a gift." Rosa's eyes widened. A gift? She wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Mr. Harrington's gaze softened, just slightly. "You saved him today, more than you realize. And for that, you've earned something few people ever do in this house. My attention." She stared at him, stunned. This was not the fury she had braced for, nor the cold dismissal she expected. Instead, it was something far more dangerous, possibility. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "From this day forward, things will be different. For you, for him, for this household." But whether that difference becomes salvation or destruction, that depends entirely on how you handle what comes next. Rosa swallowed hard, her mind racing. She wanted to ask what he meant, what he planned, but the weight of his words pressed her into silence. She could only nod, her heart pounding. Mr. Harrington stood again, adjusting his cufflinks with the precision of a man regaining control. You will continue your duties in this house, but your relationship with my son will also continue. Privately, quietly. Do you understand? Her breath hitched. Did he mean? Her thoughts tangled, fear and relief colliding. Yes, sir, she whispered. Good, he said, almost to himself. Then, with a glance at the crib, he added softly, for the first time in a long time, he looks at peace, and I can't ignore that. Rosa sat frozen, torn between gratitude and dread. She had expected punishment, but what she had received instead was something more complicated. A responsibility she had never asked for, bound now to a powerful man's fragile trust. As the baby stirred in his sleep, Rosa realized that her life had just changed forever, not with the ruin she had feared, but with a new, unpredictable path that could lead either to salvation or to a fall deeper than she had ever imagined. And Mr. Harrington, for all his control, knew that he too had crossed a line. The days that followed were unlike anything Rosa had ever experienced inside the mansion. The rhythms of work were the same. She polished the silver, swept the marble floors, washed the endless sheets of glass that caught the sun like mirrors. But underneath it all, there was a new current, a secret thread woven through her every movement. Every time she passed the nursery, every time she heard the faint rustle of the baby's breath, she felt it, the invisible bond that had been forged that day. Mr. Harrington did not speak of it openly. He did not look at her differently in front of the staff. To them, Rosa was still the maid, the woman who scrubbed and dusted and kept to herself. But when the house grew quiet, when the shadows lengthened across the halls, he would sometimes appear in the nursery doorway, his eyes lingering on the child, and then on her. It was never long. It was never more than a moment. But it was enough to remind her. He knows, and he remembers. At first, Rosa told herself she should be relieved. She still had her job. Her son still had medicine and bread. No scandal had broken. She had been spared. But the more she thought about it, the less it felt like freedom. Instead, it was as though she had been caught in an invisible cage, her every step now tied to Mr. Harrington's unspoken decision. And the child, oh, the child. He reached for her now in ways he hadn't before. When others held him, he fussed and cried. But when Rosa lifted him into her arms, he quieted, pressing his face into her chest as though he knew something the rest of the world had forgotten. His trust was pure, and it terrified her, because with every day that passed, she felt herself pulled deeper into a role she could never claim as her own. One afternoon, as she rocked him to sleep, the door creaked open. It wasn't Mr. Harrington this time. It was Mrs. Wilson, the head housekeeper, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She had worked in the mansion longer than anyone, and her authority was second only to the master himself. Rosa froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Mrs. Wilson's gaze flicked from Rosa to the child, then back again. For a moment, her lips curled into the faintest smirk. "You seem awfully comfortable with him," she said, her voice dripping with suggestion. Rosa's stomach nodded. She forced a polite smile. "He cries less when I hold him, ma'am. That's all." Mrs. Wilson tilted her head, studying her with unnerving patience. "Is that so? Funny. I've seen many maids pass through this house, and none of them seem to have quite your effect. It's almost as if you were born for it." The words stung. Rosa lowered her eyes, praying the woman would leave. But Mrs. Wilson lingered, her footsteps slow as she circled the room, her presence suffocating. Then, with a knowing look, she said, "Be careful, Rosa. Sometimes, being too good at something is more dangerous than failing at it." The warning burned in Rosa's chest long after the housekeeper left. It was a reminder that secrets never stayed buried for long. Not in a house this large, not under eyes as sharp as Mrs. Wilson's. That night, Rosa sat in her small room, staring at her son as he slept. She wanted to believe that what she had done was only an act of kindness. that the bond growing between her and the Harrington child was harmless. But Mrs. Wilson's words echoed in her mind. More dangerous than failing. What if people began to talk? What if whispers reached the wrong ears? The next morning, Rosa tried to keep her distance. She busied herself with chores, scrubbing harder than necessary, avoiding the nursery whenever possible. But it was no use. The baby's cries pierced the walls, drawing her like a compass to its true north. And when she finally gave in, lifting him into her arms, Mr. Harrington was there, standing in the doorway. He said nothing at first. He only watched as the child settled against her, his tiny fist gripping the fabric of her uniform. Rosa felt her face flush with shame, as though she had been caught again in something forbidden. She opened her mouth to apologize, but Mr. Harrington raised a hand. "Don't," he said quietly. His eyes softened, just for a moment. "He needs you." The words both comforted and frightened her. They felt like chains disguised as kindness. Because the more Mr. Harrington acknowledged her bond with the child, the less Rosa could pretend this was temporary. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was something else, something dangerous, something that blurred the lines between servant and family, compassion and scandal. And still, the danger grew. Mrs. Wilson wasn't the only one watching. The other staff noticed too. The gardener who saw her walking the baby in the courtyard. The cook who overheard the hush of his cries when she entered the room. Whispers began to spread in the corners of the mansion, small but sharp, like cracks forming in glass. Rosa knew it was only a matter of time before someone dared to confront Mr. Harrington directly. And when that happened, when the secret was no longer theirs alone, the consequences would fall on her first. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that Mr. Harrington himself was preparing for something far more drastic. He had not saved her that day in the nursery merely out of kindness. No, his mind had been working ever since, turning over possibilities, calculating risks, considering what this fragile new bond might mean for his child and for him. And when he finally acted, it would not be in the way anyone expected. Rumors are like smoke. They never stay contained. One spark, one whispered sentence in the servants' quarters, and soon the entire mansion carried the faint haze of speculation. Rosa could feel it in the way people's eyes lingered a little too long, in the hushed conversations that went silent the moment she entered a room. The cook, Mrs. Dalton, was the worst at hiding it. Her glances were sharp, almost accusatory, and though she never said Rosa's name directly, her voice carried just enough when she muttered about maids who forget their place. The gardener, too, shifted his gaze whenever Rosa passed through the courtyard with the child, as though the mere sight of her unsettled something inside him. But it was Mrs. Wilson, the head housekeeper, who truly stoked the fire. She didn't accuse Rosa outright. She didn't need to. All she had to do was raise an eyebrow at the right moment, sigh heavily when Rosa walked into the nursery, or allow her words to drip with suggestion. "The master seems very interested in the baby's care these days," she said once, her tone smooth as honey but sharp as glass. "And Rosa always seems to be nearby, doesn't she?" Every time Rosa heard it, her stomach twisted. She wanted to shout the truth, that her only crime was compassion, that the baby's survival mattered more than gossip. But shouting would only feed the flames. And besides, even if she did speak, who would believe her? To them, she was just the maid. And in a world like this, truth was often less powerful than perception. Still, the tension couldn't last forever. Eventually, whispers demand a confrontation. And it came one evening during dinner, when Mr. Harrington sat at the long oak table, his son in a high chair beside him. The staff had gathered in the dining room afterward for their own meal, but Rosa lingered near the doorway, collecting silverware. She wasn't prepared for what happened next. Mrs. Wilson cleared her throat, her voice calm but deliberate. "Sir, if I may," she began, "some of us have noticed certain patterns concerning the child." The room went still. Rosa froze, her hands clutching a handful of forks, her breath caught in her throat. Mr. Harrington set down his wineglass, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Patterns?" "Yes," Mrs. Wilson continued, her tone respectful but heavy with implication. "It seems that young Master Harrington comes only in Rosa's care, more so than with the nanny or even myself. Some of the staff have begun to wonder if perhaps boundaries are being blurred. The word struck Rosa like a blow. Heat rushed to her face, shame and fear colliding. She wanted to sink into the ground, to vanish. This was it, the moment the truth would come crashing down on her. But Mr. Harrington didn't lash out at her. He didn't dismiss her on the spot. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Wilson. His voice, when it came, was calm but edged with steel. "You say boundaries are blurred. I say my son has finally found peace." A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Wilson blinked, taken aback. "Sir, I only meant—" "I know what you meant," Mr. Harrington interrupted, his tone sharper now. "But let me be perfectly clear. Rosa has shown more devotion, more instinct, and more care for my child than anyone else in this house. If that unsettles you, then perhaps you should examine why you see kindness as a threat." The silence that followed was thunderous. Rosa's heart pounded in her chest. She had never imagined he would defend her so openly, so fiercely. Mrs. Wilson's lips pressed into a thin line, but she bowed her head. "Of course, sir. Forgive me." Mr. Harrington nodded once, dismissing her without another word. Then his eyes flicked briefly to Rosa, still frozen in the doorway. For a moment, their gazes locked, and she felt a rush of confusion, gratitude, fear, and something else she dared not name. Later that night, as Rosa lay in her small room, the scene replayed in her mind over and over. He had defended her, publicly, in front of everyone. It was the last thing she had expected. But was it protection, or something more dangerous? Because if he was willing to stand by her against the staff, then the whispers would only grow louder. What was once a secret between them was now a matter of speculation, curiosity, even resentment. And in a house built on hierarchy and control, that kind of attention could be lethal. The next morning confirmed her fears. Mrs. Dalton, the cook, slammed pots louder than usual, muttering under her breath about favoritism. The gardener barely nodded when she greeted him. And Mrs. Wilson, though outwardly polite, carried herself with a renewed sharpness, her eyes always calculating. Rosa realized that by defending her, Mr. Harrington had drawn a line in the sand. And now, she was no longer just the maid. She was the center of a battle she hadn't asked for, between loyalty, suspicion, and the master's will. And deep down, Rosa couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Harrington's surprising action at the dinner table was only the beginning. He had plans, though she couldn't yet see them. And whatever those plans were, they would pull her deeper into a world where compassion and danger walked hand in hand. That night, sleep did not come easily. The mansion seemed to breathe with me, as if the walls themselves contracted and relaxed with my heartbeat. The silence was not empty. It was heavy with something I could not name, a presence that made every shadow feel alive. Each room seemed to guard secrets, whispering their truths in the quiet corners. I finally drifted into a restless sleep, and in my dream, I walked down the narrow corridor leading to the room where I had seen the photograph lying face down. The air was thick and cold, not the kind that chills your skin, but the kind that freezes the soul. As I approached the door, I heard the soft cries of a child. They were faint, almost muted, as though someone was trying to hide them. I opened the door slowly, and there lay the crib. But it wasn't the same nursery I knew. The room felt strange, yet strangely familiar. Inside the crib, there was not a baby. It was me, small and fragile, looking up at myself with wide, fearful eyes. Then a voice spoke, not from the crib, not from me, but somewhere behind me. Deep, grave, and heavy with pain and authority. "You were not meant to know this. Not yet." I spun around, heart hammering, but there was no one. Only shadows stretched along the walls, moving as though they breathed, twisting toward me like living smoke. I woke with a jolt, my heart racing, my body drenched in cold sweat. I looked around, trying to convince myself it was only a dream. But then I heard it, faint steps dragging across the corridor outside my room. I rose cautiously, afraid to confront reality. The steps stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The silence returned, heavier this time, charged with expectation. There was a strange certainty in the air. I was not alone in this house. And for the first time, I felt the weight of what my actions had brought. Not only the risk of judgment but the presence of something I could not yet define, something waiting to test me. As I lay back down, clutching my own child close to my chest in the dark, I realized that my life in the mansion had shifted in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. The act of kindness that had saved a child had opened doors I never asked to enter, and behind them, shadows waited. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, but its light brought little comfort. Rosa moved through the mansion like a shadow, quiet and cautious, every footstep measured. The previous night's dream lingered in her mind, a chilling reminder that the walls themselves seemed alive, watching, judging, waiting. Even though Mr. Harrington had defended her openly during dinner, the mansion was a labyrinth of whispers. The staff, previously indifferent or merely curious, now carried a subtle tension that made every glance feel like an accusation. Rosa noticed it in the cook, who muttered under her breath while chopping vegetables. She noticed it in the gardener, whose polite nods were clipped, almost forced. And most of all, she noticed it in Mrs. Wilson, the head housekeeper, whose gaze was sharper, more calculating than ever. By mid-morning, the tension became unbearable. Rosa had been scrubbing the floors for hours when she heard a low murmur behind her. She turned, her hands still wet with soapy water, and saw a group of maids huddled near the pantry. Their heads were bent close together, their voices barely above a whisper, yet the words pierced through like knives. Always with him, she's too close. The master can't see this. Someone will notice. It's not proper. She could ruin everything. Rosa's hands trembled. She wanted to confront them, to shout that she had done nothing wrong, that she had only tried to save a child's life. But she knew it wouldn't matter. In their eyes, she was already guilty. Perception had overtaken reality. And in a mansion like this, perception was everything. Hours later, as she carefully prepared the nursery for the baby's afternoon nap, Mr. Harrington appeared silently in the doorway. His presence startled her, and she instinctively straightened, brushing invisible dust from her uniform. The child stirred, reaching for her, and she held him close, feeling the weight of his trust like a mantle on her shoulders. He stepped into the room slowly, eyes scanning her face, lingering on the bond forming between her and the baby. Rosa felt exposed, but she also sensed something else. Approval, quiet and unwavering. He spoke softly, almost as if to himself. Do they realize what they are seeing? Or do they only see what they want to see? Rosa nodded, unsure if he expected an answer. He continued, moving closer to the crib, his eyes fixed on the sleeping child. You've done more for him than anyone here ever could, he said, almost reverently. And that cannot be ignored. The words filled Rosa with a strange mixture of relief and fear. Relief that he understood, fear that this recognition made her even more visible, even more vulnerable. She realized then that Mr. Harrington's protection came with strings she could not yet see. Just as she was about to respond, a sharp knock at the nursery door interrupted them. Both turned toward the sound. Mrs. Wilson stepped in, her posture rigid, her eyes narrowing slightly. Sir, she began, voice steady, I believe it's time we address the growing concerns among the staff. Rosa's heart froze. She had expected whispers, perhaps subtle disapproval, but a confrontation? Now, Mr. Harrington's gaze hardened. And what exactly are these concerns? Mrs. Wilson's lips pressed into a thin line. It seems some members of the staff feel that boundaries have been crossed. They worry about favoritism, influence, and the perception of impropriety. A silence fell, thick and suffocating. Rosa could feel every second stretching, the weight of accusation pressing down like the cold air of winter. Then, unexpectedly, Mr. Harrington smiled, small, almost imperceptible, but full of authority. I see, he said, voice calm yet commanding. Let me make one thing perfectly clear. Rosa is not guilty of misconduct. She acted with courage and compassion. And if anyone here has a problem with that, well, they will have to answer to me. Shock rippled through the room. Mrs. Wilson's eyes widened, and Rosa felt as if the floor had opened beneath her. She had expected judgment, perhaps dismissal, even humiliation. But this was a declaration of war against anyone who doubted her integrity. And just like that, The rules of the mansion had changed. Rosa was no longer invisible, no longer merely a servant. She had been thrust into a precarious position, simultaneously protected and exposed, her every action scrutinized, her every word measured. Yet even in that moment, as the weight of visibility settled on her shoulders, Rosa knew one thing. Her bond with the child, the act of kindness that had started it all, had also given her a strength she never knew she possessed. And while danger lurked around every corner of the mansion, she was no longer entirely powerless. The following days were like walking on a thin sheet of ice. Every step Rosa took felt precarious, and the slightest misstep could send her tumbling into disaster. The mansion, once a place of routine, had become a labyrinth of suspicion, whispers, and half-truths. Even simple tasks felt weighted with consequence. Every time she entered a room, she felt the invisible eyes of the staff tracking her movements, analyzing her gestures, judging her intentions. Mrs. Wilson, the head housekeeper, was relentless. She would appear suddenly in the corridors, her eyes sharp and calculating, her presence almost predatory. She would remark, casually but pointedly, on Rosa's attention to the child. "You spend a lot of time with him," she would say, tilting her head. "Perhaps more than you should." Each word was measured, each tone loaded with implication. Rosa would nod silently, feeling her pulse quicken, aware that any argument could only worsen the situation. The other staff were no less dangerous. The cook would purposefully place herself between Rosa and the pantry, blocking her path, muttering about unfairness. The gardener would linger too long at the windows, watching her through the panes as she walked by with the baby, a quiet accusation in every glance. Even the maids whispered in corners, eyes flicking toward her, their voices dripping with judgment. And yet, despite the tension, Rosa could not ignore the child. He had grown accustomed to her presence, and the moments they shared were pure and unguarded. Each time he reached for her, each time he found solace in her arms, Rosa felt both a surge of love and a sting of fear. Love for the child she had saved, fear of the consequences that now hung over her like a storm cloud. One afternoon, as she prepared the nursery for the baby's nap, Mr. Harrington appeared silently at the doorway. His presence startled her, but this time, there was no fear, only a complex mix of relief and apprehension. He watched her, his eyes scanning her face as if weighing her every thought. "You've handled the tension well," he said quietly, his voice low and measured. "But it's not enough to simply endure. You must be prepared." Rosa's brow furrowed. "Prepared for what, sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "For the storm that is coming. When people begin to realize the bond you share with my son, there will be questions. There will be judgment. There will be attempts to undermine you. And you cannot let them break you." Rosa swallowed hard. I don't know if I can handle that, sir. They've already been cruel and He raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Listen to me carefully. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite fear. You saved my child. That is no small thing. And that act has placed you in a position of power, strange as it may feel. Power that can protect or destroy, depending on how you wield it." The words struck her deeply. Rosa had never considered herself powerful. She had been a maid, invisible, a servant whose opinions and actions were of little consequence. And yet here she was, entrusted with something precious, watched by a man whose judgment could dictate the course of her life. The next few days were a trial by fire. Mrs. Wilson escalated her subtle attacks, questioning Rosa's every decision, testing her composure. Other staff began aligning with her, some out of loyalty, some out of fear, creating factions within the mansion. Every corridor became a minefield, every glance a potential confrontation. And through it all, Rosa learned to move with precision, to speak only when necessary, to shield her emotions behind a calm facade. The child remained her anchor, the one constant in a sea of uncertainty. His innocent trust reminded her of the stakes, of the life she had saved, and the responsibility she now carried. By the end of the week, Rosa realized something chilling yet empowering. The mansion was no longer just a workplace. It was a battlefield. Every action, every word, Every gesture carried weight. And while the storm of judgment raged around her, she knew she could survive it, but only if she relied on the courage that had driven her to act in the first place. And at the center of it all was Mr. Harrington, observing, calculating, his own intentions hidden beneath layers of control. He had protected her once, yes, but the future remained uncertain. How far would he go to shield her? How much risk could he bear for her sake? And how far was Rosa willing to go to protect the child she had saved, even at the cost of her own safety? In the quiet moments, when the mansion slept and shadows stretched long across polished floors, Rosa allowed herself a single thought. She had stepped into a world she could never leave unchanged. And in that realization, she found both fear and a strange, unshakable strength. By the middle of the week, the mansion had transformed into something almost unrecognizable. The mansion's polished floors and crystal chandeliers gleamed in the daylight, but beneath the surface, a current of unease ran through every corridor. Rosa could feel it in the quiet glances of the staff, in whispered conversations, and in the deliberate pauses whenever she entered a room. Every action she took seemed to ripple outward, carrying consequences she could not control. The protection Mr. Harrington had extended to her acted as both a shield and a beacon. Staff members who had previously ignored her now watched closely, attempting to discern what he saw in her. Every smile, every touch toward the baby was scrutinized, measured, and weighed. Rosa learned to move cautiously, each step guided by careful calculation. The first real confrontation came one afternoon when the cook, Mrs. Dalton, approached the nursery carrying a tray of food, her expression taut and controlled. "I hear you've been spending quite a bit of time with him," she said in a low, sharp tone. "Too much, some might say. Do you think it's wise to get so attached?" Rosa stiffened, clutching the baby closer. "I am caring for him because he needs me," she replied quietly. "Nothing more." Mrs. Dalton's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Rosa. This isn't just about you. Others may not see it that way, and when they speak, the master cannot protect you from everything." The words echoed in Rosa's mind, a warning that turned her unease into something tangible. The mansion, once merely intimidating, now felt like a battlefield where loyalty and suspicion clashed around every corner. Mr. Harrington appeared silently, as if summoned by the tension itself. Observing with quiet intensity, he let Rosa navigate the confrontation alone. "You see," he said once Mrs. Dalton had left, "people fear what they cannot control. You have become something they cannot predict." Rosa realized that his defense at dinner had not guaranteed her safety. Her courage, the very act that had saved the child, had drawn her into the center of a storm. That night, the mansion's silence was deceptive. Every room seemed to harbor secrets, each shadow a potential threat. Rosa moved through her tasks with mechanical precision, aware that a single mistake could unravel the fragile protection she had been granted. A letter slipped under her door intensified her fear. Written in unfamiliar handwriting, it read, "You think you are safe. You are not. Your kindness has been noticed. Be careful who you trust." The words coiled tightly around her chest, a chilling confirmation that someone was actively observing her. The mansion, once a sanctuary, had become a space fraught with danger. The next morning, Mr. Harrington summoned her to his study. His expression was unreadable, a mask concealing whatever thoughts churned behind his eyes. "You've received a message," he stated. Rosa nodded silently. He leaned forward. "This is the world you stepped into when you chose to act. Courage brought you here, but caution will keep you alive. You saved a life, yes, but that act has consequences. You must understand them if you are to survive." Clutching the baby close, Rosa left the study with a chilling clarity. The mansion was no longer merely a place of servitude. It was a stage, and she was a central figure in a complex play of ambition, jealousy, and hidden agendas. Forces unseen were gathering in the shadows, capable of either protecting or destroying everything she held dear. By the following morning, tension had thickened to a tangible presence. Quiet glances from maids, the deliberate shuffle of the gardener's boots, and hushed voices echoed through the halls. Even the air seemed heavier, as if the mansion itself anticipated the coming storm. Rosa moved cautiously, hands steady though her heart raced. The baby slept lightly in her arms, his tiny pulse a fragile reminder of what she had fought to protect. Each moment of peace was fleeting. The consequences of inattention or misstep could strike at any second. Subtle signs of suspicion began to escalate. Whispers at breakfast, lingering glances, and veiled comments made Rosa acutely aware that the staff were watching her every move. Then came the first overt act. Mrs. Dalton spilled a tray of utensils near the nursery, her eyes sharp with accusation. "Careful, Rosa," she said with feigned concern. "Wouldn't want the master's favorite to get hurt, would we?" Rosa's hands trembled as she gathered the fallen items, resisting the urge to confront her directly. Any argument could endanger both herself and the child. Mr. Harrington appeared quietly at the doorway, commanding attention without a word. "Stay calm," he instructed softly. "Do not let them provoke you. Let your actions speak for you, always." Rosa nodded, but the unease lingered. She understood that her protection was conditional, fragile, and dependent on her careful navigation of the mansion's hidden dangers. Every gesture of care toward the child was scrutinized, interpreted, and judged. By mid-afternoon, the tension escalated further. Another note appeared under her door. "We are watching. Do not let your kindness be mistaken for weakness." The warning crystallized Rosa's fear. Someone inside the mansion was actively monitoring her, waiting for a misstep. She was no longer merely a maid performing duties. She was a target in a web of observation, suspicion, and hidden motives. The mansion had grown colder in ways Rosa could not explain. Not physically, the halls remained warm with sunlight or the crackle of fireplaces, but in the unspoken tension that filled every room. Even the previously quiet nanny and shy maids had changed, questioning Rosa's decisions and lingering near her, as if measuring her actions for weaknesses to exploit. Then came the first true act of malice. Rosa found the baby's favorite blanket deliberately soaked and folded on the floor. Someone had intentionally disrupted her routine to provoke fear. Mr. Harrington arrived moments later, silently observing. "Do you know what this means?" he asked softly. Rosa shook her head. "Someone is trying to intimidate me, sir." "Exactly," he said. "This is only the beginning. You've drawn attention, both good and bad. They see what you've done for him but cannot comprehend it. That will make them dangerous." Rosa understood fully that the act that saved the child had painted a target on her back. Every staff member now had a reason to watch, question, or challenge her. The mansion, once a place of routine, had become a battlefield. Rosa moved like a shadow, aware that each gesture and word could tip the balance towards safety or catastrophe. Even the breakfast table had become a stage for power and scrutiny, with Mrs. Wilson questioning her every move, veiled with polite but pointed remarks. Rosa realized that courage alone was insufficient. Survival required strategy, vigilance, and foresight. Each act of compassion had consequences, each interaction a test. And through it all, Mr. Harrington remained her anchor, guiding her subtly, ensuring she learned to navigate the mansion's invisible web. Every step, every careful decision, had become a delicate negotiation between survival and care, where no kindness went unnoticed and no act of attention was without risk. The mansion breathed with anticipation, each echo hinting at schemes in motion. The nursery, once a sanctuary, was now a stage under constant scrutiny. Even the smallest acts, folding blankets, adjusting toys, were measured, catalogued, and interpreted. Rosa understood that the stakes had never been higher. The child's life, her own safety, and the delicate balance of trust and loyalty within the mansion depended on her precision, patience, and unwavering focus. Later, while tidying the library, she noticed a fleeting shadow slip across the hallway, subtle but deliberate. Someone was following her, observing her every move with intent. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. Panic could not show. Strength had to remain visible. Returning to the nursery, Rosa discovered a note tucked beneath the crib mattress. "Not all eyes are friendly. Beware the ones who smile at your back." Fear coiled in her chest like cold steel. It became clear that someone inside the mansion was actively monitoring her, testing her reactions, and judging every gesture of care she gave the child. Each act of kindness, once simple and instinctive, now carried risk. That evening, Mr. Harrington summoned her to the study. His presence was steady, commanding, yet an undercurrent of urgency ran beneath his composed exterior. Gesturing for her to sit, he fixed her with a piercing gaze. "You've seen the warnings," he said quietly. "This is the consequence of courage. You saved a life, but in doing so, you disrupted the delicate balance of this household. The staff is unsettled, and some may act in ways that are dangerous." Rosa nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand, sir. I will be careful." "Care is good," he replied, "but vigilance is better. Trust must be earned, even within these walls. Not all who appear to be allies truly are. Remember that." Leaving the study, Rosa felt a chill linger in her spine. Mr. Harrington's protection was powerful, but it was not invincibility. Every corridor and shadow in the mansion could conceal intentions that might turn hostile in an instant. That night, back in the nursery, she held the baby close, listening to his gentle breathing. Her courageous act of nursing him had saved a life, but it had also ignited a storm that could erupt with a single misstep. The mansion, once a space of routine and order, had become a battlefield. Rivalries, suspicion, and hidden ambitions of the staff created a constant tension that Rosa had to navigate. The child remained her anchor, the center of her world, yet the forces she had disrupted gathered strength in the shadows. Survival demanded more than courage. It required foresight, cunning, and absolute focus. Days passed as a relentless test of her resolve. The mansion seemed alive with invisible eyes, each whisper and glance a potential threat. Rosa moved with deliberate care, aware that each gesture and word could tip the fragile balance of safety. Staff members grew bolder. Hushed warnings became overt challenges. One morning, she found another note on the changing table. "Compassion is dangerous here. Trust no one." Her pulse quickened, but her resolve hardened. Every act of kindness had become ammunition for those who resented her position. Mrs. Wilson cornered her again, eyes narrowed, voice deceptively calm. "Rosa, people are talking. They question why the master favors you. It makes others uncomfortable. Perhaps it would be wise to remember your place." Rosa's pulse raced, but she spoke steadily. "I am doing what is right for the child. That is all. Right? Or convenient?" Mrs. Wilson leaned closer. "Be careful. Actions have consequences." That night, sleep eluded Rosa. Every creak of the floors, every distant voice, every brush of wind against the windows felt like a signal. She held the baby tighter, silently vowing to protect him no matter the cost. A knock startled her, and Mr. Harrington entered quietly, observing her closely. "You've been challenged," he said softly. "Soon, it will be more than whispers. Be ready." Rosa nodded, heart pounding. "I will, sir. I must." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Courage brought you here. Vigilance will keep you alive. And remember, the child trusts you completely. That trust is your strength." Shadows lengthened across the halls. Rosa realized the mansion was no longer merely a home. It had become a battlefield, and she was at its center. The storm arrived one gray, windy evening. Whispers escalated into confrontations. Small acts of sabotage intensified. A shattered vase near the nursery, a scorched apron in the kitchen, rumors spreading like wildfire. Rosa moved with precision, senses heightened, acutely aware of the stakes. Mrs. Wilson attempted a direct challenge before the staff. "You think you are special because the master favors you? Favoritism can turn quickly." Before Rosa could reply, Mr. Harrington stepped forward, silencing the room. "Enough." Rosa acted with compassion, saving a life when it mattered most. That courage is not a threat. It is a gift. Anyone who cannot see that has no place here. Silence fell, thick and tense. Staff murmured under their breath as the challenge dissolved under the master's authority. Rosa exhaled, the weight on her chest easing slightly. Later, in the quiet of the nursery, she cradled the baby. The storm outside rattled the windows, but inside, fragile peace reigned. Mr. Harrington stood in the doorway. "You've endured much," he said, softer now. "Yet you remain steadfast. That is rare." Rosa looked up, exhaustion and determination mingling in her gaze. I will protect him, sir. No matter what. I will ensure you are never alone in this, he replied. Your courage has not only saved a life, but earned respect. Let that guide you. The mansion may have shadows, but together, we can navigate them. For the first time in weeks, Rosa felt a sense of safety. The threats remained, but she had allies and had proven her strength. Her compassion had not only saved a child, it had revealed her courage, resilience, and the power she never knew she possessed. As the night deepened, Rosa held the baby close, feeling his warmth and trust. The mansion, once a place of fear and whispers, had become a testament to survival, courage, and the quiet power of kindness. Rosa knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with unwavering resolve, for even in darkness, compassion could light the way.